Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of the third episode of the second season called Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow. And in short, it is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And the saddest part is that this episode actually had some great potential. I don't actually mind the overall idea of it. There even were some moments I actually liked, but a lot of other details don't really make any sense. And we can argue that time travel episodes never really make a lot of sense if we really analyze them, but it was never as silly as this, because there are a lot of conveniences, a lot of contrivances, and apparently just sheer luck that anything works out at all. But anyway, I'm jumping ahead. Let me start from the beginning. So the episode starts with Lan doing her usual security duties on the ship, which apparently includes settling arguments between crew members. We see the Nobulan arguing with the non-binary transporter chief, apparently about some lost item that the Nobulan is saying that the transporter chief stole something, I guess, and so it's never really explained. And also, why is it the Nobulan in Starfleet, since in the previous episode they just said that genetically augmented people are not allowed in, but didn't Phlox say that the Nobulans also practice genetic engineering, so maybe they stopped doing that by this century? Maybe they reversed their augmentations to be allowed into the Federation. And also by the end of the episode we have pretty much direct confirmation by a genetic test that Lan Noonien Singh still has a lot of Noonien Singh genes in her. So why was she allowed in Starfleet? But anyway, that's a discussion for another time. Then she goes over the ship, and apparently someone was complaining about Spock making too much noise with his new guitar, which was given to him by the Doctor, even though he already had it in Star Trek Discovery back in season 2 of Discovery when Michael walked into his quarters on the Enterprise. We saw he already had that instrument, and yet in this show the Doctor gave it to him, and only now he started practicing it as if he never had it before. And so, as always, no attention to detail, even to the internal continuity of these new shows. Maybe things changed because of the temporal stuff that we are going to see in this episode. Next we see Lan training with the Doctor, who's now a martial arts expert. I guess they decided to make him more interesting, so he's now like Blade. He can kill people easily because he used to be in the war or something. In the previous episode we saw how easily he can beat up Klingons as long as he takes some drug that he always carries around with him. So now he's a super expert in martial arts. So anyway, they're sparring and she's angry about something all the time, and he tries to talk with her but she refuses and then leaves. And then she walks the corridor, and suddenly a temporal agent appears in the corridor, and he's wounded and bleeding and dying, and she somehow immediately knows that he was harmed by a bullet. How can she assume that? Maybe he was stabbed by a sword or something. How can she possibly know it was a bullet? Especially since I guess she never saw a bullet wound before, and yet somehow magically she knows it. Does she have X-ray vision that she can see the bullet inside of him? It's never explained. She just knows it. And then he hands over a device to her and tells her there was an attack in the past and she has to fix it. And then he tells her, get to the bridge. And as he hands it over, he disappears and everything on the ship changes apparently, even though the ship looks exactly the same after the change. And she comes to the bridge. And the only real difference we see is that the captain is now not Pike, but instead it's Jim Carrey who's the captain. And everything else is exactly the same. The ship looks exactly the same. Everyone has exactly the same haircuts as in the original timeline, if we can call it original. And he doesn't recognize Lan. They all think she's an intruder, and yet they don't call security to escort her out. They just leave her standing on the back of the bridge as they discuss something with the captain of a Vulcan ship, who is apparently Spock. So this is all in a new timeline that just got created because of the attack in the past, in which the Vulcans never joined the Federation. There is no Starfleet, there is no Federation. And yet Spock somehow still exists. Spock, who's a half-human, half-Vulcan hybrid, which was really rare even in the Prime timeline. So in this new timeline, in which they never even became part of the Federation, they're not allies with Earth. In this scene we see Spock begging them to help the Vulcans against the Romulans because they're fighting a war with the Romulans, and Kirk refuses, and so they're not in good relations with the Vulcans, and yet Spock still exists somehow. So anyway, Lan asks to speak with Jim alone, and they go to his ready room, and she tells him she's from a different timeline in which he's not the captain, and then he tries to take the device from her, and they fight over it and then accidentally press the button and appear in the past, in what looks like today, even though they don't mention a specific date. but everything looks exactly like today. And there was a funny scene in which he kind of looks around and thinks he's in old New York, and then she tells him it's Toronto. I did find that funny. And all those scenes we saw in the trailer, which I was complaining about, him not knowing how to go through a revolving door because he's from space and never been to Earth, and also all the scenes of them hooking up and kissing and all of that. I said how ridiculous it all was when I saw the trailer because I assumed it's the Kirk that will later be in TOS, and so I said how silly it is that he says he comes from space and hooking up with Khan's great great granddaughter, which made absolutely no sense to me, but at least we now know that he's from an alternate timeline, and so at least all of that stuff is not as annoying to me as it was when I saw the trailer of this season. So anyway, they go into the store and steal a bunch of clothes and then run away, and then they need to get some money, and so Jim decides to play chess with people, which somehow earns him money. I guess he bets with people that he will win, even though he had no initial cash on him, and so somehow he made a bunch of money that way. And he said he will only do it in a few minutes, and then apparently Lan just stands around for hours as he's playing, and he says that 2D chess is for idiots because he's used to the three-dimensional version, and that's why it's so easy to him. Now, there were scenes in TOS in which Kirk was beating even Spock in chess, and so I don't have a problem with this idea. But it was kind of strange how he managed to win so much money in such a short time that Lan was literally standing next to him all that time, and then he buys them hot dogs and she doesn't want to take one for some reason. And there's a scene in which they talk about his brother Sam, and he says that everyone calls him George, and she says that no one calls him George, and that's a reference to a scene in TOS in which Kirk said the same thing about his brother who died, and apparently his brother died in his timeline, the one that he comes from, and that was the point in which he agreed to help her, because up until that point he was just kind of goofing around and not really planning to help her change or restore the timeline, because he thought his timeline is more important. But then as they talk about their different histories, apparently in his history all of the Earth was destroyed and is now a toxic wasteland, and all of humanity lives only in space, but that somehow is not enough to convince him. When she tells him that Earth was not destroyed in her timeline, that's not enough to convince him of anything. Only when he discovers that his brother is alive in her timeline, only then he agrees to help her. So that seems to be really selfish, like he doesn't care about billions of people dying, but he only cares about his own brother, which dies anyway later on, which is kind of funny. And there's also the scene in which they steal a car, and so he tries to drive it and then drives backward. And that's straight out of that episode with the gangsters when Spock and Kirk tried to drive a car and then he drove backwards. And these are all references I actually kind of liked, but then they go on this chase scene for absolutely no reason and they drive around recklessly around the city. It really reminds me of season 2 of Star Trek Picard, which was also all about time travel, and it all felt very cheap, like they stole a police car and they drove around in a so-called chase scene, but not a single scratch on any car happened throughout the whole episode. And so the same thing here, they steal a car and they go on this chase scene, but it's kind of really pathetic. They just drive around quickly and nothing happens, and so it's totally pointless and really cheap. So anyway, they go to a hotel and they sleep in different rooms because they have so much money suddenly because of playing chess. And Lan cannot sleep and she considers going over to his bed, but in the end she decides against it because there's no way in hell that in this new Trek show that they'll ever show a heterosexual relationship. So in the morning they keep arguing about how to change the past or restore the past and so on, and Jim doesn't want to do anything because he wants to get back to his own reality. And then suddenly we see a huge bridge exploding right in front of them. It just happens to be right in front of their hotel window, conveniently. And then she remembers that the temporal agent told her, get to the bridge. And that's why she went to the ship's bridge, but apparently he meant this bridge which just blew up. That's what he actually meant when he told her to get there. So anyway, they go there and she somehow notices that some of the wreckage looks like it was hit by photonic weapons. Just like she knew that guy was hit by a bullet somehow. You know, if she had Geordi's visor or something, or some unique ability, some extra vision or something, then maybe it will make sense. But she doesn't, and so how does she keep knowing which weapons caused what with absolutely no real evidence? And they see a piece of the wreckage getting taken to a van, and that's when they have the chase scene I talked about. And also during the chase, she only now realized that Jim has no reaction to her last name, that he accidentally called her Noonien Sung instead of Singh. And you know what's funny about this whole thing with her ancestor, that she keeps crying about her childhood, everyone making fun of her because of her last name. Why the hell didn't she ever change her last name? Why would she keep it? You know, if you had the last name Hitler because you're descended from him, and it bothers you so much because everyone looks at you strangely because of that, because you chose to keep that name, why wouldn't you change that name? So it's never explained, and it kept bothering her all her life apparently, and so he's the first guy who she ever met who is not bothered by it, because according to his history it never happened. So it kept bugging me throughout the episode that she never directly asks him if the eugenics wars happened in his timeline or not. They never really discussed it. Only toward the end of the episode actually deals with it, but they do it in a silly way. Anyway, I'll get to that shortly. And by the way he got this car is by using a Vulcan nerve pinch on the driver, and he explained it that he was once in a Romulan prison and had a Vulcan cellmate who taught him how to do it. So how come in the original timeline Kirk never knew how to do a Vulcan nerve pinch when his best friend was Spock? It's so easy for a human to learn it apparently, that this alternate Jim Kirk somehow knows how to do it and the original one didn't. And across the episode he's kind of a buffoon. He's much more similar to the Chris Pine version of Kirk than the original, and of course he also looks like Jim Carrey, so was really bad casting in my opinion, and he's been a buffoon and annoying across the whole episode, and only Lan has any brains at all. Only she figures everything out across the whole episode. So because he's driving around recklessly for no real reason, the police arrests him, and miraculously they're saved by an SJW woman who is filming the police and telling them that they just arrested some famous scientist or something, and the police get scared by that and they let him off with a warning and get away. And that woman is the same one they earlier saw at the bridge. She was photographing the bridge and they asked her to look at the camera and all of that, and so I guess she followed them and somehow rescued them from the police. And this woman turns out to be some kind of a conspiracy nut who believes that aliens are sabotaging the progress of humanity to keep them stuck on this planet and not going out into space, and that there's an international cabal of humans who are covering everything up in order to steal pieces of the alien technology, which is kind of counterproductive. If the aliens who are trying to slow down the progress of humanity keep leaving their alien technology all over the place, wouldn't that cause the opposite effect? And she shows them a bunch of photos of conspiracy events, and in one of them we can see what looks like a TOS era Romulan warbird, which is kind of strange since they didn't have time travel technology at the time of TOS, so that was a bit weird. And the funniest part about the scene is that when Lan asks how did she get this photo, she said that an astronomer tried to take a photo of the International Space Station and accidentally caught this ship instead. And I found that really funny since you can see the sky around it is completely cloudy. So why would the hell would anyone try to take a photo of the International Space Station, which I'm pretty sure is above the clouds, on such a cloudy day? Like someone decided, you know what, this is the perfect day to try to take a photo of the International Space Station in the most cloudy day that I can. Like this is so ridiculous. Like who writes this stuff? The writers don't know anything about science at all, since they keep making such silly mistakes in all these new shows. And then she tells them that this cabal of international conspirators who are covering up the aliens, they have their headquarters right here in Toronto for some reason, and that they have quantum computers and a working fusion reactor, and then they keep thinking about how to find this fusion reactor, and Jim says, if only we knew an engineer who lived on Earth from the Stone Age, who might be secretly an alien with a bunch of technology. And then Lana thinks, oh wait, in the beginning of the episode, when I met Nat Guinan, she told me something about working at an archaeology department in Canada, and so what a perfect coincidence, what a perfect convenience, let's just find her. And so they go around looking for Nat Guinan until they find some amateur storage place in which it says archaeology department, which is just her own place. And apparently they spent days going to universities and all kinds of official places to look for it, and in the end it's just some poor warehouse in which, by the way, she's stealing archaeological artifacts from across history. And early in the episode she said that she thinks maybe this whole utopia of the no money society is just a fad, and maybe later on money will once again be needed, and so that's why she's keeping all these ancient artifacts just in case she needs the money later on or something. So I didn't actually mind that first scene in which she appeared in the episode. I thought it's cute, but now it becomes sillier and sillier. So they find her in the past, And Lan says that she knows her secret and all of that, and then she lets them in. And then they start asking her about how to find a fusion reactor, and she must know how since she's an alien and she's an engineer. And then she says, I never studied engineering. I didn't even study math ever since the time of Pythagoras or something like that. And then basically she's totally useless. She doesn't know anything about science, even though she's an alien, and so she cannot help them. In the end, they do kind of concoct some other solution using some watch with some phosphorus material which will glow the closer they get to the reactor or something like that, and then they just go around the city for hours just hoping to randomly stumble on this reactor. So they just walk around the city and looking at the watch until the dials turn green from the radiation, which is silly. You'd think if there was such strong radiation in the middle of the city, someone would have noticed, but not with the logic of New Trek, apparently. And then they find an institute which is called the Noonien Singh Institute. And they see that people can only walk in when they do a handprint. They have to put their hand on a device which scans the hand, and only that way you can get in. And then because she sees the name Noonien Singh on the building, she thinks it must not be a coincidence, and so she tries to put her hand on the scanner, and somehow it works. Somehow it opens the doors for her. Which is absolutely ridiculous. First of all, handprints are not related to genetics. Like, just because you're related to someone doesn't mean you'll have the same exact handprints. Even identical twins don't have the same exact fingerprints to each other, so it's not related to genetics. So that's the first problem. I guess we can explain that maybe this device is actually scanning your DNA and not your actual fingerprints, so let's let that slide. But then we have other problems. Later on we see that Khan is actually held as a prisoner inside this facility. So if the scanner actually opens the door for his DNA, so why would anyone design a prison in which the prisoner can open his own doors? I guess maybe he's not a prisoner, maybe he likes being there, even though it kind of looks like a prison. And lastly, Lan is many generations after him. So wouldn't her DNA be so diluted that it wouldn't be detected, and yet it still opens all the doors as if she has the exact same DNA? So nothing about any of this makes any sense. And apparently that's the reason that time traveler picked her for this mission, because he knew that only she will be able to get into that facility because of her DNA, and that's why he came to her to send her to the past. But all of this is ridiculous. Are you telling me that a time traveling agent with all his super technology cannot get through a simple door? Like, he cannot simply beam in beyond the door? Like, he has to get her so that her handprint can open the door because he couldn't do it, so he needs her for this mission. So he's able to time travel, he's able to beam into places, and yet he cannot get past a wooden door. So that's absolutely ridiculous. And the same with this woman who turns out to be a Romulan, who shows up suddenly. So she's been waiting for them to break in because she also couldn't get in. At least in her case, we can assume maybe she doesn't have any advanced technology, that she was accidentally marooned on this planet without any advanced technology, and that's why she couldn't get in, even though you would think with her knowledge, wouldn't she be able to hack into the system, like she's centuries from the future, and yet cannot break through this wooden door. She also needed Lan to open the door for her, because only Lan can do it. And so all of this is absolutely ridiculous. So presumably she's the one who shot that time traveling guy from the beginning. So now she's threatening to shoot them if they don't open the doors for her, because apparently she wants to get in to blow up that fusion reactor, which Jim says that in his timeline actually happened. He told Lan earlier that Toronto did blow up around this time period from a massive explosion that created his timeline. And so it again doesn't really make sense, because when the time traveler gave the device to Lan and told her to get to the bridge, how did it already create the alternate reality in which Toronto blew up if this woman cannot get in without Lan's help? So the time agent who gave her the device is actually guilty of the same thing he tried to prevent, because by giving her the device, he gave the key to the Romulan woman in the past who shot him the ability to get into the fusion reactor to blow it up. So why did he do that? Why did he give Lan the device, enabling the Romulan in the past to blow up the reactor? So none of this makes any sense. So anyway, Jim stands in front of her saying that if you shoot me, it will turn on the alarms and then you wouldn't have enough time to get to the reactor, and then she shoots him anyway, and then he dies in Lan's arms. And then she pushes Lan into the building and says, now that the alarms are on, I don't have enough time to get to the reactor, so let's go to plan B instead. And we see in the corridor like two arrows. One is for the reactor and the other one for the genetic research facility, and then they go there instead. And then they see like little kids' drawings on the walls and stuff like that, and then on the door it says Khan, which is kind of written by a kid apparently. So I guess he's not a prisoner. Maybe he likes being there since his own handprint would open the doors apparently. So obviously Khan is inside there and he's still a little kid at this point, which again contradicts continuity, but at least they kind of explain it in this episode because the Romulan woman says that all of this was supposed to happen in 1992. But because of all the interferences by the time travelers, it all got delayed by 30 years, that she was stuck on Earth for 30 years waiting for this moment. And this kind of confirms a theory I had about, the time traveling causes changes in the timeline, which can be used to explain all the continuity issues. I made whole videos about this topic, and so this line directly confirms it. And so it means this whole show is taking place in a completely different timeline from the original Star Trek, in which they directly said the eugenics wars happened in the 90s, and here we have a confirmation that it is all indeed a new and different timeline, because Lan also remembers that it did not happen in the 90s, and so that means this entire show is taking place in a different timeline from the original Star Trek, which I'm kind of fine with, because that's what I've been saying they should have just admitted, and so it's kind of like they did. And all of this also fits what we saw in season 2 of Picard, when we saw Sung finding that little folder which said Project Khan, and he decides to revive that project apparently, and all of that took place around 2024. In this episode they don't actually give us any date, so let's assume it's 10 years later. So that will fit with what we see here when Khan is just a little kid. So maybe Sung created him and a few other augments, and all of this was based on something that was supposed to happen earlier and got delayed for reasons. And so that's why the eugenics wars happened later in this new timeline, which also fit what we heard in the previous season of this show when Pike said that the Third World War was indeed the eugenics wars. And an episode ago there was also another continuity issue when they said that the eugenics wars killed 30 million people, and yet in other places we heard the figure 600 million, so which one is it? I guess we can say maybe 30 million died directly during the war itself, and maybe the other millions died from the nuclear fallout after that, and so maybe that way we can explain the inconsistency. And obviously this episode is simply using the different timeline excuse. Another continuity issue is when this Romulan woman admits that she's a Romulan and said something about changing her ears. Lan doesn't seem surprised at all by that comment. And yet the OS humans in this time period didn't yet know who the Romulans were. They didn't know what they looked like, there was never a visual communication with them, they had no idea they're related to the Vulcans. And here Lan is not surprised at all to hear this Romulan talking about having to change her ears to fit in. It's not a direct contradiction, but it's another continuity issue. And when Pike saw the Romulans in the previous season, he also didn't seem surprised by them looking like the Vulcans, and so maybe in this new timeline, they knew who the Romulans were much earlier. And maybe that's why Lan is not surprised by this woman being a Romulan. And also it's kind of iffy that she says that she was stuck on Earth for 30 years, and yet she looks kind of too young to be that. We know that Romulans and Vulcans age more slowly than humans, but it still kind of feels unbelievable. It would have been better to cast someone who's a little bit older and more evil looking, maybe, because this cute young woman doesn't really look like a villain. And it's also ridiculous that she's an alien from the future with future knowledge and future technology, yet she cannot get through a wooden door without Lan's help to open it. And she threatens her with a gun and orders her to open Khan's door for her. And at first I thought she wants to open the door to free and unleash Khan so that he can start the nuclear war, and which will weaken humanity and all of that. That's what I thought at first, but then she explains her entire evil plan is to actually prevent the eugenics wars. She actually wants to kill Khan so that the eugenics wars do not happen, because that way the Federation will never be formed. Because if there are no eugenics wars, then humanity doesn't go through this hardship, which means they will not evolve into the Federation in the future somehow. And also, why would they even want to prevent the Federation in the future? If they are from the future, don't they know that the Federation is the one who saved the galaxy from the Borg and the Dominion and all of that? So if they sabotage humanity, wouldn't they just destroy themselves? Wouldn't that mean humanity will not save them in the future? So none of this really makes any sense if we think about it. And why tell all her evil plans to Lan? She just wants her to open the door, so just make her do that? What's the point of revealing your entire evil plan to her? Wouldn't that just convince her not to cooperate if you say that by killing Khan you will screw up humanity and there will be no federation? Why tell her that? Why not do the opposite? Why not lie to her to convince her to help you? Simply say you want to save humanity. Keep pretending to be good. Say that you're doing all of this for good reasons. Instead, you reveal your evil plan, which will just convince her not to help you. So all of this is absolutely ridiculous. And also, all you need from her is her handprint, right? So why not just shoot her and then drag her to that panel and put her hand there? What's the point of trying to convince her to do it? Does the panel know that you're doing it from your own free will, otherwise it will not open? Like if she's unconscious when she puts her hand on that scanner, it will not open if she's unconscious. It reminds me of that line from TNG when Data was confronting that scientist from the so-called future and asked him, I presume your hand will open the door if you're conscious or not, and then that guy got scared and opened it. So why not here? Why does the Romulan need her to make a decision to open it by her own when she can just shoot her and then put her hand on the scanner? And so none of this makes any sense. So anyway, then Lan does open the door, but then attacks the Romulan woman, and they fight it out, and then Lan shoots the Romulan. And then the Romulan presses something on her neck, which vaporizes her own body, and so she's gone. And then the door is open, and she goes in, and then she sees little cute Khan, who's just a little boy. And now Lan has a moral dilemma to make. Now she's seriously considering to simply kill Khan and prevent the eugenics wars. And then she tells him, are you alone here? Are there others like him? And then he looks at the photo on the wall, and we see a bunch of kids like him who are all wearing red. Just like in the original episode of Space Seed, Khan and his men were all wearing red. They had the exact same outfits ever since they were kids. And also earlier in this episode when she was telling Jim about Khan and how his legacy is genocide and torture and death and all of that, it's also kind of a continuity issue because in the original episode Space Seed they directly said that Khan was the best of the tyrants, that there were no massacres under his rule, and so obviously he never committed a deliberate genocide. I guess we can consider the nuclear war itself to be genocide, but in the original Space Seed episode it was stated that Khan was not the most evil tyrant, so maybe it's some of the other ones who were causing the bigger catastrophes, and so releasing Khan here actually makes sense, because if she doesn't, or if she kills him, then one of the worst ones will take over instead, and it will be even worse. So that would have been more clever to say why she needs to release Khan specifically, because some of these other kids will be an even worse and more evil tyrants who will cause more damage, and that's why Khan has to be let go, because he was the best of the tyrants, because even some of the Enterprise crew in the original show kind of admired him. They said there were no massacres under his rule, and so what she said earlier in the episode about his legacy being genocide and torture and death is also not really accurate. And then she decides to transport back to the future right in front of Khan's face, which is also an odd choice because that means he would know about such technology existing. And then she arrives back in the future and everything is back to normal. And then she sees Nat Guinan again on the bridge, and they kind of share a look. And so it's meant to be like that Guinan situation in the TNG episode Time's Arrow, in which Guinan was both in the past and the future, and there was like that time loop thing. And so I guess that's what they were trying to do, and yet here it was kind of pointless because she didn't really help out in the past in any significant way. And so all of this was kind of unnecessary. And then when she comes back to her quarters, she gets a visit from a woman from the Temporal Investigations Department. So she's from the future, and she came back to recover the device, and she also tells her, no one else but you could have completed the mission. So again, that means only because her handprint could somehow open that door, that's why she was the only one who could do that. So all these temporal agents who can beam in and out of places, anywhere in the universe they want, they couldn't get past that wooden door in the 21st century. Only Lan could have done that. So all of this is extremely silly. Why not just erase her memory if it's so important, if you have to make sure she doesn't tell anyone? So it doesn't really make sense, and so she takes that device and then disappears and leaves. And then Lan is left alone, and she decides to make contact with Jim Kirk. I guess to make sure it's not the same one she met in the past, who she saw die, so why would she think it will be him? I have no idea. So I guess she was hoping that somehow this new Kirk will remember what happened since she fell in love with him, so she is hoping, I guess, they can continue it. And so she contacts him with the pretext of needing some information about his brother who is serving on this ship. and she has some information missing in his personal file. So why does Jim not ask her, why don't you just ask George or Sam? Why don't you ask him directly? Why do you need to contact me on another ship to fill in some missing information about my brother? Like, none of this makes any sense, and yet he thinks it does. And then she realizes it's not the same one she met in the past, and then she's crying because she was in love with that other one who died, and this one doesn't remember her, and so this is all a tragedy. Like, I don't mind this particular storyline, and I'm hoping they will not meet again, because again, it will be ridiculous that Kirk knew Khan's great-great-great-granddaughter and never mention it to him later on. So all of this would be ridiculous. So hopefully they never meet, and I would like to see as little as possible of this Jim Carrey Kirk, to be honest, because I just don't think it's a good fit for the character, this actor. I don't have anything against him as an actor, but he just looks so different from the original Kirk that it just annoys me. And this show did at least finally admit it's all in a different timeline from the original, because they directly said that because of the changes in the past, the events of history are different from what it was supposed to be in the original series, and it fits with my own theories, which I was saying for years that should be the explanation. I was making many long videos about this topic. I will link them in the end of this video. And it can even be used to explain why people look different, because, you know, if events across centuries are happening differently, then would the same exact sperm cell meet the same exact egg at the same exact moment? If all of history is different, how exactly would the same exact pieces of DNA meet each other and all of that? And so maybe they don't. Maybe all of these characters are genetic siblings of themselves, meaning they were born to the same parents, but a different sperm cell might have impregnated the egg, and so that's why they're similar but different. And so we can even use that to explain why the characters look different, because they are actually genetically different from the original timeline, and yet still have the same names and all of that, and same gender by accident. Or maybe temporal agents are manipulating all the events from the far future to make sure that history goes correctly, and so they're correcting all these events in secret from the shadows, and that's why everything is so similar and yet different at the same time. So to summarize my opinion of this episode, I don't think it's terrible. I actually enjoyed some parts of it, and the overall idea of it is also fine. I would have been perfectly fine with it if they paid better attention to the details, if things made more sense logically. And it's too bad, because this episode actually had the potential to be good, but the details were so silly, and the cheapness of it was so obvious. Like, inside that super duper facility with the fusion reactor and the genetics lab, we just see a bunch of corridors and a door which says Khan on it, and that's it. We don't really see anything amazing in any way anywhere in the episode, and so it just feels really cheap and with so many logical problems. Like, why was Spock in that alternate timeline we saw? If humanity and Vulcans never became friends in that reality, how the hell did Spock came to be? So that's one logical problem. And everyone on the bridge even having the exact same haircuts and same uniforms, nothing seemed different in that alternate timeline. If it was such a horrible timeline in which Earth was destroyed, wouldn't it radically change everyone's personalities? Wouldn't it be more like an evil version of Starfleet and all of that? And yet apparently it was basically the same. So that's a missed opportunity. Remember all those episodes in Stargate SG-1 about alternate timelines, and how every time they did that, they did something cool with it, they showed something interesting, like Tilk still working for the Goa'uld and still being evil and having an evil ponytail and different haircut and all of that. So those kinds of little details, as silly as they are entertaining. They add something to it, at least visually, do something interesting with it, play with it a little bit. And yet here everything looked exactly the same. Ortega's haircut was exactly the same. The sets were exactly the same, nothing evil in this new timeline, and so it was a missed opportunity not to play with it. If you have this setup anyway of having a different timeline in which you can basically do anything you want, why not play with that? Why not kill some people off, blow up that ship, do something spectacular when you have the opportunity, and yet they missed it. And so that's why this episode feels extremely cheap, extremely lazy, and not that well written. Which is too bad, because it could have been better. So that's my opinion. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.